The cook left without collecting her wages, a Miss Marple mystery. There is a particular kind of guest at a seaside hotel in late September. The summer crowd has gone. The rooms are half empty. Everyone who is left has chosen to be there. And that, Miss Marple would tell you, is always worth noticing. Who listens to a story like this at this hour? Someone at the end of a long day, perhaps. Someone who needed 5 minutes to themselves. Maybe you are sitting somewhere quiet, or not quiet at all, with the world going on around you, and just this in your ears. Tell me where you are. I read every comment. The hotel register has been signed. The cook has already gone. We are a little behind. Chapter 1. The Tricillian Arms stood at the far end of Polcaro Cove's only street, separated from the harbour by a fish yard and an optimistic flower bed, and from the cliff path by a low wall over which the wind came at all hours without apology. Miss Marple arrived on the 23rd of September, a Wednesday, on the 4:30 bus from Truro, because Raymond had read her the train timetables twice and she had still not been able to follow them. The manager came out to the step when the bus pulled in. He was a man of perhaps 52, with the kind of careful clothes that suggested a man keeping standards in the face of reduced circumstances, and a smile that was perfectly pleasant and perfectly impenetrable. He introduced himself as Mr. Sefton. He carried her case himself, and spoke about the weather in the way that people spoke about the weather when they meant to speak about nothing at all. The hotel was quiet. September had emptied it. Miss Marple counted 3 other guests at the dinner table that evening, not including the tall, fair-haired man who came in late and sat alone at the window table, and the couple near the fireplace who appeared to be resting from some great effort Miss Marple could not identify. She unpacked slowly. The room was pleasant enough. The wardrobe had somebody else's coat in it, a woman's coat, dark blue wool, with a button missing on the left cuff. She mentioned it to the housemaid, who came to turn down the bed, a local girl named Ida, with talkative eyes and careful hands. "Oh, that'll be Mrs. Fane's," Ida said, and then closed her mouth as if she hadn't meant to say it. Miss Marple did not press her. She had learned long ago that pressing was seldom necessary if you were patient. At dinner, she was given a table near the window. The dining room smelled of beeswax and something else, something she could not name but associated in some vague way with hospitals, or perhaps with the back rooms of chemists' shops. She ate her soup and watched the room. The couple by the fireplace were Mr. and Mrs. Fane, she gathered, the woman pale and quiet, with the look of someone in the later stages of a worry she had carried a long time, the man solicitous and watchful in the particular way that men were watchful when they felt themselves responsible for something precarious. They spoke little. They did not need to. The fair-haired man at the window table had a continental squareness to his jaw and ate with good manners and no pleasure. He did not speak to anyone. When Mrs. Fane came in after the first course, already seated when he arrived, he looked at her once. Not the glance of a man noticing a woman, but something quite different, something careful and very briefly alarmed, and then did not look at her again for the rest of the meal. Miss Marple noticed this because she noticed things, and because there was a quality to the not looking that reminded her of Mr. Partridge, who had served on the parochial church council for 4 years, alongside Mrs. Anselm, and had spent those 4 years not looking at her in precisely that way. Though in that case the explanation had been entirely different, and had come out eventually at the Easter vestry meeting. She did not know yet what this meant, but she tucked it away. After dinner, she sat in the lounge with a library book she did not read, and listened to the wind come in off the sea, and thought that Polcaro Cove was very quiet for a place where several different things appeared to be happening at once. Ida brought her a small pot of tea at 9 o'clock without being asked, which Miss Marple found touching. "The salt cellar on the gentleman's table," Miss Marple said, as Ida set down the tray. "I noticed it was on the left side. Is that usual?" Ida looked puzzled. "He moved it himself, I think. I laid it center, like always. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought you might have done." She thanked Ida and poured her tea and said nothing further, and Ida left slightly confused, which was not Miss Marple's intention, but was not entirely unwelcome either. Chapter 2. The Fanes. By the second morning, Miss Marple had a reasonable picture of the establishment and its inhabitants, which was not unusual. She had always found that hotels, like villages, delivered their essentials quickly to anyone paying attention. Major Bryce Collis she met at the foot of the stairs before breakfast, a large, comfortable man in old tweeds with binoculars around his neck and the contented expression of a person who arrives in a place they have missed. He had been coming every September for 9 years, he told her, and knew the coastal path well enough to walk it in the dark, which he had done once by accident and once deliberately. He knew Ida's mother and Tom the barman's father, and had a running account at the hotel that Mr. Sefton had maintained for him through 3 changes of ownership. "Good man, Sefton," he said, buttering his toast with confidence. "Runs a tight ship. Had a bad time of it a few years back, but seemed to have sorted himself out." Miss Marple said she was glad to hear it, and wondered what a bad time might have looked like, but the Major had moved on to the Cormorants. Miss Palliser arrived late to breakfast, dark-haired and distracted, with the kind of beauty that would have been arresting if she had remembered to direct it at anything. She ordered eggs she did not eat, and read through a notebook with the frown of a woman looking for something she had already found and was not sure what to do with. "The fair-haired man, Mr. Voss," Tom told her when she inquired, a business visitor from Bristol, did not come down to breakfast at all. Miss Marple stored this. She met the Fanes properly at mid-morning, in the garden behind the hotel where a bench faced south, and caught the weak September sun. Mrs. Fane was there already, wrapped in a coat that was not the blue one from the wardrobe, that was still, as far as Miss Marple knew, hanging where Ida had apparently not yet thought to remove it. She was a woman of 50 or so, fine-boned and hollow in the way of people who had been worried for a long time. She had the slightly distant manner of someone listening for a sound in another room. They spoke about the coast, about the light, about whether it would rain before lunch, which it would, Miss Marple thought, though she did not say so. Mr. Fane, Colin, his wife called him, joined them after 10 minutes. He was a solid man, well-dressed, with a pleasant face and the small evasions of a person who has agreed to be someone they are not and is now finding the agreement costly. He spoke too carefully about his wife's health. He mentioned Cheltenham twice without being asked about it. Miss Marple, who had lived in a village all her life and had therefore observed the interior architecture of other people's arrangements with more thoroughness than most, understood almost immediately that they were not married. Whether to each other, she could not say. Whether to anyone else, she did not yet know. It was not her business. What was her business, or what would become so shortly, was the expression on Mrs. Fane's face when Mr. Voss walked through the garden at 11:15 on his way to the cliff path. He did not look at her. She watched him go, with the stillness of a woman who had spent some time deciding what to do and had come, perhaps last night, perhaps that morning, to a decision. Miss Marple looked at her knitting. That evening after dinner, she saw Mrs. Fane cross the lounge and speak briefly to Mr. Voss near the door to the corridor. She could not hear what was said. Voss's face did not change. Mrs. Fane came back across the lounge and sat beside her companion and picked up her book and did not read it. Miss Marple read a chapter of her library book, which was a history of Cornish fishing practices that she was finding more interesting than she had expected, and thought about recognitions and old debts and the particular expression on a man's face when someone from the past has spoken to him and there is nothing friendly in the past they share. She thought of Mrs. Clement's cousin, who had appeared in St. Mary Mead one summer after 12 years away and had sent 3 separate households into quiet uproar, simply by being there. The past, she had always found, was durable. It came back. It came back, whether you had kept it carefully or buried it deep, and it did not particularly care which. Chapter 3. What Ida Found. She was wakened at 10 minutes to 8 by the sound of running feet on the corridor above her, which was not the sound hotel corridors usually made. By the time she had put on her dressing gown and opened her door, Ida was already at the end of the corridor below, speaking to Mr. Sefton in a voice pitched too low for words, but not too low for distress. Mr. Sefton went up the stairs. Miss Marple went to the window and looked at the garden, which was empty, and the sea, which was grey, and thought about sounds and their meanings. At 8 o'clock, Mr. Sefton knocked at her door to tell her, very properly, that there had been a death in the night, and that the hotel would be somewhat disrupted, and that he hoped she would bear with them, and that breakfast would be served in the lounge rather than the dining room. "Mrs. Fane?" Miss Marple said. He paused in a way that confirmed it, without admitting that it did. The local doctor came at 8:15. His name was Tregear, and he was the kind of doctor who decided things in the way that people who have decided things many times do, thoroughly, carefully, and with a full acknowledgement of the limits of what could be known without a proper examination. He said heart failure, he said her history suggested it was consistent, he said he could not be entirely certain without more information, but that there was nothing visible to contradict the conclusion. Colin Fane received this news in the lounge with a cup of tea that grew cold in his hand. Miss Marple sat near enough to observe and far enough to be unobtrusive. He did not cry, he sat very still, and once or twice he looked at the wall with the expression of a man performing an internal calculation. Miss Palliser came through from the breakfast table, saw what the situation was, and went back out again. Major Bryce Collis said something quiet to Sefton, and then sat with Fane for 20 minutes without speaking, which was exactly right. Mr. Voss did not appear until 9:30, when he came down the stairs in his coat, nodded to the room in general, and asked Tom, the barman, at what time the post office opened. Miss Marple watched him do this. She asked Ida, when Ida came to clear away the tea things at 9:30, how Mrs. Cheggwyddon was this morning. Ida set down the tray and looked at her. "She's not here, ma'am. She went last night." "Went where?" "Nobody knows." Ida lowered her voice, without appearing to lower it. "She left after supper service. Her coat's gone, and her bag, but she hasn't collected her wages. Mr. Sefton pays on Thursdays, and last Thursday she said she'd wait until next week because she had enough for now, but she didn't come for them." Miss Marple said this was unusual. Ida said yes. Ida said Mrs. Cheggwyddon had been at the Tricillian Arms for 11 years and had never once left without notice. Ida said she had seemed frightened yesterday evening, which Ida had put down to the atmosphere in the kitchen because the vegetable delivery had been wrong, and these things sometimes set Mrs. Cheggwyddon off. But now, Ida was less certain. "Was there anything in the kitchen yesterday evening?" Miss Marple asked. "Anything unusual?" Ida was quiet for a moment. The evening cocoa tray for Mrs. Fane sat out in the passage for a bit. Mrs. Cheggwyddon had made it up, and then had to go and speak to Tom about something, and when she came back, she said someone had been near it, and not to mind, that was silly, but she was not herself at the time. "Quite," said Miss Marple. Inspector Treloar arrived from Truro at 11. He was a compact, unhurried man, with ginger eyebrows and good boots, and a manner that suggested he had heard a great many explanations and was in no hurry to hear another. He spoke to the doctor, to Sefton, to Fane, and to Ida. He did not speak to Miss Marple, who was knitting in the lounge. She did not expect him to. She would have been mildly surprised if he had. What she did expect, and what she got, was a further conversation with Ida at 11:45, in which Ida confided that Inspector Treloar believed Mrs. Cheggwyddon had probably panicked and gone to a relative, and that when found, she would explain things satisfactorily, and that in the meantime, the death was being treated as natural until the doctor's report suggested otherwise. Miss Marple said she was sure that was the right approach. She sat with her knitting after Ida had gone and thought about the cocoa tray in the passage, and about who had been near it, and about how long a tray would sit in a corridor before it was collected. She thought about the expression on Voss's face at dinner on Monday, and about the decision on Mrs. Fane's face on Tuesday morning, and about what Mrs. Fane might have said to him in the lounge that evening. She thought about the cook who had left without her wages. The wages were 11 years of Thursdays. Whatever had frightened Mrs. Cheggwyddon had frightened her more than 11 years of Thursdays. Miss Marple found this extremely significant. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Theory. Inspector Trelaw did his work quietly and thoroughly, and kept it largely to himself, which Miss Marple respected. She observed what she could, which, in a hotel where the lounge served as the common room and meals were still taken communally despite everything, was a reasonable amount. Fane gave his statement on Thursday morning in the small room off the hallway that Sefton used as an office. He was in there for 40 minutes. When he came out, his face had the specific quality of a man who has not been caught in a lie, but knows that the distance between not caught and caught has narrowed considerably. Voss gave his statement in the afternoon. He was in there for 25 minutes. Miss Marple heard his voice through the wall. She had positioned herself in the chair nearest the office on the pretext of a draft, and it was even, informative, and exactly as cooperative as a man with nothing to hide would be, and no more. She thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. Major Bryce Collis walked his cliff path at 3, as he always did, rain or otherwise, and came back at 5 with mud on his boots and something on his mind. He sat opposite Miss Marple in the lounge and looked at the fire. "Knew a Voss once," he said, apparently to the fire. "Different fellow, probably. Different name, too. Peter, I think the original one was called. Good family. Belgian side. Disappeared in 1939. Miss Marple waited. "Funny thing, names," said the Major. "Man disappears, turns up somewhere else, tends to want to be someone else while he's at it. Understandable, really, given the times. Less understandable now." He poked the fire and said nothing further, which Miss Marple took to mean he had said what he meant to say. She thanked him for the kindness of his company, and he said it was no kindness, it was self-interest, and would she like sherry before dinner? She would. At dinner, Mr. Voss ate carefully, and at 7:30 excused himself and went to his room. Miss Palliser ate nothing again and wrote in her notebook. Fane ate too much and drank more wine than usual and went to bed early. Mrs. Ragh, who had been staying at the Tricillian Arms every September for 9 years, and whose views on the situation Miss Marple was beginning to value highly, ate everything put in front of her, had a small whisky after, and said that the police were always wrong the first time, and usually right the third time, and that in her experience, the middle theory was always the most interesting. "What is the middle theory here, do you think?" Miss Marple asked. "I think," said Mrs. Ragh, "that whoever made that woman sick was someone she already knew, and that the cook knew they knew each other, and that is rather different from anything the inspector has on his list." Miss Marple agreed that it was. "The inspector has Fane down as suspicious," Mrs. Ragh said. "I understand why. Fane is obviously lying about something, probably about being her husband. The question is whether the lie he is telling is about her death or about her life." She put down her glass. "Rather different things, those." Miss Marple said yes. Mrs. Ragh said good night and went upstairs, and Miss Marple sat for another 10 minutes, looking at the fire and thinking that she had underestimated Mrs. Ragh considerably, and that this was her own error and she should have known better. She thought about lies. There were the lies that people told because they had done something terrible, and there were the lies that people told because they were doing something small and embarrassing that had nothing to do with anything terrible at all, and which were simply there, in the investigator's path, collecting suspicion that did not belong to them. Colin Fane, she was almost certain, was the second kind of liar. The first kind was still in this building and had gone upstairs at 7:30 and had a room on the second floor with a window that faced the sea. She wound up her knitting and said good night to Tom the barman and went upstairs slowly, counting the stairs as she always did in unfamiliar buildings, and thought about Antwerp and 1938 and the way a man reached left for the salt. Chapter 5. Miss Palliser's Errand. On Friday morning, Miss Palliser attempted to leave. Miss Marple knew because she was in the breakfast room at 7:45 when Ida came through and said in a low voice to Tom that Miss Palliser had asked for the car to Truro at 9, and would he please tell her it had been arranged. Tom said he would. Ida went back to the kitchen. Tom went to the telephone. At 8:55, Miss Palliser came downstairs with her luggage, which was not much, a leather case and a typewriter in its case, and stood at the front of the hotel with the look of a woman who has decided something difficult and is not going to be argued out of it. The car did not come at 9. At 1:15, she went to find Sefton. Miss Marple did not hear this conversation. She heard its aftermath. Sefton's voice, explaining about the driver's family situation, the difficulty of short notice, the 2:15 train from Truro, which could still be caught easily with the later car at 12:30. Miss Palliser came back to the hall, stood for a moment in visible frustration, and then did something interesting. She put down her case. She carried the typewriter back upstairs herself. She came back down without it and went directly to the small table in the corner of the lounge where the newspapers were kept, and sat down with nothing and looked at the wall. Miss Marple chose the chair nearest to this. They sat for several minutes without speaking. The fire crackled. Outside the window, 2 fishing boats moved in the harbour. "It never quite works, does it?" Miss Palliser said at last, not looking at her. "Leaving. It depends why one is leaving," Miss Marple said. Miss Palliser looked at her for the first time with what appeared to be genuine attention. She was a striking woman when she was present in herself, which she had not seemed to be before. "You're sharper than you look," she said. Miss Marple said she had heard this before. Miss Palliser looked at the window. "I came here for a reason that turned out to be irrelevant. I came here looking for someone. I thought I'd found him, and then I realized I hadn't, and then I realized I'd been wrong about nearly everything for 11 years, and then a woman died, and the police are sniffing around, and Sefton won't give me a car." She said this all at a level pace, like a woman reading out a list she had been preparing for some time. "The person you were looking for," Miss Marple said. "Do you still believe he might be here?" Miss Palliser looked at her hands. "I think he might be. I think he is not the person I was expecting." She did not say more, and Miss Marple did not press her. She had enough to be going on with. The car came at 12:30. Miss Palliser was not in it. She was sitting in the garden with her notebook and a cup of tea, looking at the cliff path, and from the angle of her attention, Miss Marple guessed she was watching Tom Rowe, who was stacking wood against the back wall of the kitchen garden. Miss Marple went back to her room and her library book on the Cornish fishing industry and thought about 11-year searches and wrong people and how very often the thing you were looking for was behind you rather than ahead. She thought about Mrs. Cheggwyddon, who had still not been found, and she thought about the letter, because there must have been a letter. Mrs. Fane had been the kind of woman who wrote things down. She had been, Miss Marple thought, the kind of woman who had decided to do the right thing, and had written it down in the way that people write things down when they want to be sure of themselves, or when they want to be sure that someone else will know, afterward, what they knew. That letter was somewhere. Whether Voss had found it was the question. If he had, he would have destroyed it. If he had not, Inspector Treloar was going to find it eventually, and when he did, the pleasant fiction of heart failure was going to become considerably less pleasant. She wondered if Voss knew this. She suspected he did. Chapter 6. What Mrs. Ragh Remembered. Mrs. Cecily Ragh was 72 and had been coming to Polcarrow Cove since before it had a proper road. She had seen the lifeboat called out 11 times from this village, 3 of which had been recoveries rather than rescues. She had seen 2 marriages end in the lounge of this hotel, and 1 begin, in circumstances that she had always considered best not inquired into. She had known Mrs. Cheggwyddon since the woman had first taken the kitchen, and she had her own views. She expressed these to Miss Marple on Saturday afternoon, in the garden, where they had established a kind of regular afternoon truce with the weather during which it refrained from raining, and they committed to sitting outside regardless of the temperature. "Edna Cheggwyddon," said Mrs. Ragh, wrapping both hands around her cup, "is not a woman who runs. I have known her for 8 years, off and on, and she is the most stationary creature I have ever met. She has an opinion about everything. She argues with the vegetable man every week, and she has argued with Mr. Sefton about the soup stock, and she argued with a guest in 1952 about a matter relating to fish that I will not bore you with, and on every single occasion she stood her ground and was unpleasant until the other party gave way. She does not leave. She especially does not leave without her wages." Miss Marple said this was consistent with what Ida had told her. So, something frightened her, Mrs. Ragh said, badly and quickly. Not the sort of frightened that makes a person hide in the pantry and refuse to come out. The sort that makes a person put on their coat and go before they've had time to think. Miss Marple asked whether Mrs. Ragh had any idea what she might have seen. "I have a thought," Mrs. Ragh said. She looked at the sea. "On Thursday evening, I was in my room at about 10:15. I go up early, I am not ashamed of it, and I heard footsteps in the corridor below mine, which is the kitchen passage corridor. This is not unusual. Staff use it all hours, but I heard 2 sets of feet, not one, and one of them moved very quickly, the way people move when they do not want to be heard and have misjudged the echo." Miss Marple waited. I looked at my watch. 10:17. I did not think of it again until yesterday, when I was trying to remember the exact sequence of Thursday night. "And the second set of feet," Miss Marple said. "Can you say anything about them? Weight? Pace? Heavier than a woman, not running, but urgent, going toward the back stairs, not the front." Miss Marple thought about this. "The back stairs lead to the second floor," she said. "They do," said Mrs. Ragh. "They also lead to the kitchen and to the passage where I understand Mrs. Fane's cocoa tray sat for some time Thursday evening." They looked at each other. "You haven't told the inspector," Miss Marple said. "I told the inspector about Mr. Fane's behaviour at dinner and about Miss Palliser's notebook, both of which he found very interesting. I did not tell him about the footsteps, because at the time I did not know they were significant, and now I am not certain how to frame them, given that I cannot identify them with any certainty and do not want to point at the wrong person." "No," Miss Marple said. "Pointing at the wrong person is very destructive. I have seen it do considerable damage." "I thought," said Mrs. Ragh, "that I might tell you and see what you thought." Miss Marple thought for a moment. She thought about the corridor, about the timing, about 10:17 on a Thursday evening, which was 20 minutes after Voss had gone upstairs, and roughly 12 minutes before the cocoa tray would have been collected by Ida for delivery. "The tray," she said. "Ida told me it sat in the passage for approximately 15 minutes, while Mrs. Cheggwyddon was dealing with something in the kitchen, between about 10 and 10:15. Mrs. Ragh absorbed this with the composure of a woman who has lived long enough to receive confirmation of bad things without displaying surprise. "Then it would have been accessible for about the first 15 minutes, and my footsteps were at 17 past, which means someone was in the passage until at least 17 past. And Edna heard or saw them and left before midnight and has not come back." Miss Marple finished her tea. "I think," she said, "that Mrs. Cheggwyddon is sitting in a relative's house somewhere within 30 miles of here, in considerable distress, and that she would very much like someone to tell her that she is not going to be blamed for something she did not do. Can you tell her that?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said, "but I think I will be able to, in a day or two." She wound up her knitting and looked at the sky, which was promising rain before 5. "You have been very useful, Mrs. Ragh," she said. Mrs. Ragh looked pleased and disguised it. "I am old enough to know, useful from flattery," she said. "And that happens to be both." Miss Marple smiled and went inside. Chapter 7. The Letter. She found it by accident, which was also not quite an accident. She had developed a morning habit of walking in the garden before breakfast. Doctor's orders, she told herself, though the doctor had said nothing about gardens, and this brought her past the kitchen window at 7:15, when the light inside was yellow and domestic, and Mrs. Cheggwyddon's replacement, a girl from the village whose name Miss Marple had learned was Cathy, was dealing with the porridge. On Sunday morning, she passed the kitchen window at the usual time and saw, through the glass, Mr. Sefton at the kitchen table with a small envelope in his hand. He was looking at it with the expression of a man who has found something he does not know whether to give to the police or destroy, and is aware that whichever he chooses will be irrevocable. Miss Marple continued her walk. She thought about the envelope. She thought about where it might have come from, the most obvious possibility being Mrs. Fane's room, which Sefton would have had occasion to clear. Whether the police had searched it thoroughly was not something she knew for certain. Inspector Trelaw was methodical, but his attention had been heavily concentrated on Fane and on the missing cook, and a letter in a drawer, under something, inside something, might have been overlooked, or might have been examined and returned if it appeared irrelevant. Or it might have been found by Sefton himself in the course of the ordinary business of the hotel and be the source of his current difficulty. She went in to breakfast. At 9:30, she knocked at the door of Sefton's office and said that she had found she was missing a particular book from her room, a thin, blue-covered volume, and wondered whether it had perhaps been taken by accident with the linen, and could he help her look. He said, of course, and stood. And at that point she looked at his desk and said, "Forgive me, is that a letter from the village? I noticed the handwriting on the envelope looks rather like my friend Mrs. Andrew Arthur in Truro, who was going to write." It was not, of course, from Mrs. Andrew Arthur in Truro, who did not exist. But the hesitation this produced told her several things. First, that the letter was addressed in a woman's hand. Second, that Sefton recognized the hand. Third, that his hesitation was not the hesitation of guilt, but of a man uncertain what his duty was. She did not pursue it. She thanked him for his trouble about the book. She went back to the lounge. In the lounge, she sat and thought about what she knew. Mrs. Fane had spoken to Voss on Tuesday evening. She had come back to her chair with a face that had made a decision. A woman who had made that decision and was the kind of woman who wrote things down would have written things down that night. She would have addressed the letter, to the police perhaps, or to her solicitor, or to someone she trusted, and she might have left it unposted for a day, to see whether speaking to Voss had been enough. She had died on Thursday night. She had not posted it. Sefton had found it. He had not given it to Trelaw, not yet, which suggested it implicated someone other than Fane, and that Sefton was uncertain whether he owed this establishment's reputation to the police or to itself. She would need to speak to Trelaw, but she needed to be careful. She had no evidence, only inference, and her inferences rested on a man reaching left for the salt, a walk in Antwerp in 1938, and the sound of footsteps at 10:17 on a Thursday night. She needed one more thing. She needed to know what Voss had been doing before he came to Bristol. She thought of the Major and his binoculars, and of what he had said about a Belgian family and a name that had disappeared in 1939. At luncheon, she placed herself next to Major Bryce Collis and said, as if returning to an interrupted conversation, "You mentioned Voss the other day. The earlier one, I mean. Do you happen to know anything of his history? Before he disappeared?" The Major looked at her for a moment over his bread roll. He was, she thought, a man who had arrived at his own conclusions by his own methods and had been sitting with them for several days. "Shipping," he said at last. "Continental trade. Antwerp, mainly. Rather murky business toward the end, from what I understand. The sort of thing that was murky in 1938 and couldn't be discussed openly afterward." Miss Marple thanked him for the bread roll he passed her and said nothing further. She had enough. Chapter 8. What she remembered. The click, when it came at an unexpected moment. It was Sunday evening, after dinner, and Miss Marple was watching Voss reach across the table for the menu card that Tom had left near the centerpiece. And as his arm went left, she thought of Mr. Hargreaves. Mr. Hargreaves had lived in St. Mary Mead for 12 years, from 1946 to 1958, and had been considered by most of the village to be a very pleasant, very ordinary retired man of some kind of commercial background. He had reached left for things, which was not left-handedness, but habit. Belgian habit, Miss Marple had always thought, from his continental years. Mrs. Hargreaves had never discussed where he had been before 1946, which was not unusual in itself. Many people did not discuss the years before 1946, which contained more than most of them wished to carry into peacetime, but had become unusual when the subject came up directly, and she had still not discussed it. Mr. Hargreaves had died in 1958. His papers had been cleared by his wife and a solicitor, and that had been that. Miss Marple had thought about this at the time, and had decided there was nothing to be done and no reason to pry. She had been right, probably. She had also always suspected that Mr. Hargreaves had not always been Mr. Hargreaves, and she had been right about that too, only she had had no way of knowing it, certainly until a Belgian trade document had come through the County Records Office in 1962, connected with a property dispute entirely unrelated to the Hargreaveses, and had mentioned in a footnote the name Vosson and a shipping concern in Antwerp. She had noted it and thought nothing more of it, because there was nothing to think. Mr. Hargreaves was dead. His wife had moved to Bournemouth. Antwerp was 20 years ago. But here was the left-handed reach again, and here was Antwerp again, and here was a dead woman who had known a man there in 1938, and had seen him at dinner by the light of the Tricillian Arms dining room, and had recognized him. Not Mr. Hargreaves, of course. That had been a different case, a different man, a different life entirely. What she was thinking about was the pattern. A man who had been one person in one country before the war and had decided, when the war provided the opportunity, to become another person in another country. This had been fairly common in those years. The machinery of the continent had dissolved a great many identities and reconstituted them elsewhere, and not all of the people who had reconstituted themselves had done so out of innocent necessity. The question was not whether Voss was Vosson. She was now very nearly certain that he was. The question was what Vosson had done in Antwerp in 1938 and 1939 that required such thorough erasure, and the answer to that, she suspected, was in Mrs. Fane's letter and in Major Bryce Collis's phrase, murky business, the sort that couldn't be discussed openly afterward, which meant collaboration of one kind or another, or worse. Mrs. Fane had known this. She had been there, or someone she trusted had been there, and she had carried the knowledge for a long time without doing anything with it, and then she had come to Polcarrow Cove in September and seen him at dinner and had decided, finally, that she was going to speak. She had spoken, and he had listened and had gone to the bar and had decided. Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting and looked at Peter Voss, who was now reading a newspaper with the focused attention of a man who has assessed his situation and found it manageable, and thought about how people miscalculated. He had miscalculated, she thought, on 2 points. He had not known about the letter, and he had not known about her. She put down her knitting and said good night to the room in general, and went upstairs, and at the top of the stairs she passed Sefton, going in the other direction, and they nodded to each other, and she thought about the envelope in the office drawer, and about how much longer she could reasonably wait. One more day, she decided. She needed one more piece. Chapter 9. The Garden. Monday morning. Inspector Treloar came back on Monday at 11, which Miss Marple had not known he would do, but was not surprised by. He came with a constable and spent an hour in Sefton's office and another 20 minutes with Tom in the bar, and then he came out into the garden for air, and Miss Marple was in the garden because she had been in the garden since 10:30 on the reasonable assumption that if Treloar came back today he would want air at some point. He did not acknowledge this. He sat on the bench at the south end and looked at the sea for a moment. "Miss Marple," he said. "Inspector Treloar," she said. "You've been here a week now." I have a picture," he said, "of a hotel full of people, keeping secrets, most of which are irrelevant. Fane is not her husband. He's been interviewed again. The relevant secret there is nothing more than a long-standing and arguably tedious arrangement that became complicated by her death and by the fact that her actual husband, from whom she had been estranged for 6 years, is going to be notified. That accounts for Fane's behaviour. Miss Palliser's notebook contains, as far as I can read it, and she let me, which was interesting, a series of notes about a man she believed to be living in this village under a false name. She's not sure of it. She is, I think, in the process of giving up that belief." Miss Marple waited. "Mrs. Cheggwyddon was found yesterday at her sister's in Redruth," Treloar said. "She is not well. When she is well enough we will take a statement. I have a preliminary account from her sister, who spoke to her. She says Mrs. Cheggwyddon believes she saw someone in the kitchen passage on Thursday evening near the cocoa tray who had no business being there, and that she is frightened she will be blamed." "She won't be blamed," Miss Marple said. "No," said Treloar, "she will not." He looked at her. "We have the doctor's preliminary report. It is not conclusive, but it is not satisfied with heart failure. There are some markers that require further examination." "I see," said Miss Marple. "I also have," he said, "an envelope that Mr. Sefton brought to me this morning. He found it in Mrs. Fane's room when he cleared it. He should have given it to us when we first searched, but he had it and then wasn't certain, and has now done the right thing." He paused. "I haven't opened it yet. I was waiting until I had spoken to everyone today." Miss Marple said nothing. "I wonder," Treloar said, "whether you have any thoughts about Mr. Voss." She considered for a moment. Not what to say. She had known what to say since Sunday evening. But how to say it in a way that gave the inspector what he needed without telling him how she had come to know it, which was through a salt cellar and a footnote and a reach across a dinner table, none of which would appear in any court document, and none of which needed to. "I wonder," she said, "whether anyone has established Mr. Voss's precise whereabouts between, let us say, 10 in the evening and midnight on Thursday." Treloar looked at her. "I also wonder," she said, "whether the pilchard trade between Bristol and the continent is as extensively regulated as it presumably once was. I ask because Mr. Voss seems very knowledgeable about it, and I have sometimes found that men who are very knowledgeable about a business have been in that business rather longer than they admit, and under rather different circumstances." She said this mildly, as she said most things. "And his previous name," she said, "if he had one, might be worth tracing. There was a shipping family called Vosson in Antwerp before the war. I believe some of their records survived." Treloar sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Belgian records." "Belgian records," Miss Marple agreed. "The county archive received some, in connection with a property matter, in 1962. I happened to see them. I have a good memory for names." She picked up her knitting. "I won't keep you," she said. "You have the letter to open." She gathered her things and went inside, and left him looking at the sea, which was green this morning and quite calm. Chapter 10. The letter opens. She did not know what the letter said. She would never know exactly what it said, because its contents were entered into the investigation record, and Inspector Treloar did not share police records with elderly ladies at Cornish hotels, which was entirely appropriate. What she knew was what happened afterward. Voss was asked to attend the police station in Truro on Tuesday morning, ostensibly to assist with inquiries about import documentation that the inspector had questions about. This was done courteously and without any suggestion that he was being compelled to come. He came. He drove himself, which told her something. He did not come back. She knew this when the car that should have returned him at midday did not come back, and when by 4 o'clock no message had reached the hotel. Sefton informed the remaining guests at dinner that Mr. Voss had been detained in Truro on a business matter of some urgency. His expression communicated that this was not a business matter of any commercial kind. Mrs. Ragh looked at Miss Marple across the table and said nothing, which was its own conversation. Major Bryce Collis cut his lamb with the composure of a man who had expected something like this for 4 days. Miss Palliser was not at dinner. She was on the harbour wall. Miss Marple could see from the dining-room window. She was sitting beside Tom Rowe. They were talking. They talked for a long time. Ida came to Miss Marple's room at 8:30 with a hot water bottle that had not been requested and which was therefore an excuse. She sat on the edge of the chair that guests were not supposed to use and said in a low voice that the inspector had telephoned Sefton and that there would be an announcement of some kind, and that she, Ida, was frightened. Miss Marple said she was not to be frightened. "Did you know?" Ida said. "From the beginning?" "Not from the beginning," Miss Marple said. "I noticed something at dinner on the first evening. I did not know what it meant until much later." "Was it the salt?" Miss Marple looked at her with mild surprise. "You remember that? I thought it was odd when you asked me about it." Ida put her hands in her lap. "I didn't know what it meant. It meant very little on its own. Most things mean very little on their own. It was several things together that meant something." Ida was quiet. Then she said, "Mrs. Cheggwyddon would have lost her position if it had gone on being thought she had something to do with it." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "she would have. And she didn't. She did not." Ida nodded slowly, in the manner of a person arriving at a destination they have been travelling toward for some time. "You'll be leaving Thursday," she said. "Friday, I think," Miss Marple said. "I ordered sea air and rest, and I intend to have at least 3 more days of it." Ida almost smiled. She stood up and adjusted the hot water bottle and said good night, and went out, and Miss Marple listened to her footsteps go along the corridor, light, quick, relieved, and thought about how much of justice was invisible. It happened in offices, in letters, in police stations in Truro, and in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. It did not arrive in the form most people expected. It arrived, if you were lucky, in the form of a hot water bottle at 8:30 and a girl's step going lighter down the hall. She opened her library book and found her place and read about pilchard seine fishing in the 1880s until the light began to hurt her eyes, and then she turned off the lamp and lay in the dark for a while listening to the sea, which had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. This was comfortable, she found. She fell asleep quite quickly. Chapter 11. Mrs. Cheggwyddon's Wages. She spent Wednesday in the way she had originally intended to spend all 7 days. A morning walk, her book in the garden, an unhurried lunch, an afternoon watching the fishing boats in the harbour from the bench by the low wall, and the particular pleasure of being somewhere that was not St. Mary Mead and did not require anything of her. Mrs. Cheggwyddon returned on Wednesday afternoon. She arrived in the van of a relation who did not come inside, and she stood in the entrance of the Tricillian Arms for a moment, with the look of a woman who has been away longer than she meant to, and is not certain what she will find. Ida came through, and took her arm, and led her toward the kitchen. Sefton appeared briefly, spoke to her in a low voice, and went back to his office. Miss Marple, watching from the lounge doorway, thought that Mrs. Cheggwyddon looked like someone who had survived something she had not expected to survive. She had the slightly lightened expression of a person from whom something heavy had been removed without warning, who was still checking that it was gone. She did not speak to Mrs. Cheggwyddon. There was no reason to. Everything that needed to be said would be said by Inspector Trelaw, in whatever form a statement required, and would be said properly and in the right order, and that was as it should be. At 4:30 she heard from Ida, who stopped by the garden to give her the Wednesday newspaper, that Mrs. Cheggwyddon had collected her wages. Mr. Sefton had kept them, Ida said. He wasn't going to do anything with them. He was keeping them for when she came back. Miss Marple said this was right and proper. He's not a bad man, Ida said, with the air of someone who has revised an opinion. He should have given the police the letter faster. But he wasn't doing it to protect anyone bad. He was just uncertain. Uncertainty is a great source of small moral errors, Miss Marple said. The important thing is what one does with it when one becomes certain. Ida considered this and went back inside. Miss Marple read the newspaper without great concentration and thought about the modest, durable question of what decent people owed each other when the world required something difficult of them. Mrs. Cheggwyddon had been frightened and had run, which was human. Sefton had found the letter and been uncertain, which was also human. Trelaw had been methodical and polite and had arrived at the right conclusions in the right order, which was what policing was supposed to be, and often wasn't. The Major had said his careful piece and left the rest to others. None of them had done everything exactly right. All of them had done enough. She thought about the woman who had come to dinner in September and had seen a face across the dining room and had made a decision. The decision had killed her. This was wrong and would remain wrong, and no resolution altered it. But the decision had also produced the letter, and the letter had done what she intended. This was not quite justice, but it was what was available, and she had learned to hold these things alongside each other without expecting one to redeem the other. The sea caught the late light on the water and went bronze and grey and bronze again. One more day, she thought. That was all she needed. One more day of sea air and no one requiring anything of her, and then she would pack her case and thank Ida and say goodbye to Mrs. Ragh and the Major and possibly to Miss Palliser if she was still here, which Miss Marple thought she might be, and she would take the bus to Truro and the train from Truro and be back in St. Mary Mead by evening and find everything exactly as she had left it, and that would be that. She folded the newspaper and went in for tea. Chapter 12. Departure. She came downstairs at 9:15 on Friday morning with her case already packed, which Ida had offered to carry and which Miss Marple had given her, not because she could not carry it herself, but because Ida wanted to be useful and had earned the right to be. The morning was clear. After a week of threat and occasional delivery, the sky had decided on blue, which seemed pointed. The harbour glittered. The two remaining fishing boats sat at anchor with their reflections intact below them. Mrs. Ragh waved from the breakfast-room window. Miss Marple waved back. The Major was in the car park, which was not an accident. He raised his hat with the solemnity of a man who has been through something with someone and considers this worth acknowledging. Safe journey, Miss Marple. Safe watching, Major. He seemed to find this adequate. He went back to his binoculars and the cliff path, and she watched him go and thought that he was a man who would come back here next September and the September after, and would sit in the same chair and drink the same sherry, and know that the Tricillian Arms had been through something, even if the hotel register showed nothing unusual for that week in September. Some knowledge was like that. It sat in the fabric of a place, in the way the staff moved, in the careful way Sefton greeted the next guests. Miss Palliser was not in the entrance. Miss Marple had not expected her to be, having seen her at breakfast in the early contemplative silence of a woman who is staying. The car to Truro came at 9:30, as arranged. Ida brought the case down the steps and put it in the boot, and said goodbye with a brevity that suggested the alternative was getting upset, which she was not going to do. "Thank you for everything," Miss Marple said. "You didn't need anything," Ida said. "You were the least trouble of anyone." This was, Miss Marple thought, not strictly true, though she understood what was meant by it. She settled into the back seat. The car pulled out of the car park, past the flower bed, past the fish yard, and onto the only street in Polcarrow Cove. She looked back once through the rear window. The flag was flying over the Tricillian Arms. It had not been flying the day she arrived. She had noticed that, because she noticed things, and had not been flying the 3 days after the death, and was flying now. The hotel was open for business. The next guests would find a quiet Cornish fishing village in the last days of September. A dining room smelling of beeswax, a manager who smiled with careful warmth, and a housemaid named Ida who knew your habits within 24 hours of your arrival. None of the next guests would know how close they had come. Miss Marple turned back to face the road and opened her knitting, which she had been unable to finish in the past week, for reasons she had not, at the outset, anticipated. She took up the needles and found her count and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of rest, and the car went inland, away from the sea, through the lanes between the stone walls, toward Truro, and then toward home. The sea air had done her good. The doctor would be pleased. She made 3 rows before Truro,